Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the monastery, the open bar of the internet, the world's greatest shit show, and the place where we, the good brothers and sisters of this most holy of temples, seek enlightenment through the drunkest, craziest, and most batshit ways possible. I am your one and only gaming monk, better known as Mildra, and with me I have a newcomer into the temple, coming to us as the developer of the Utopia TTRPG. The man better known as Oridont, not to be confused with Orido. How are you doing today, man?
I'm doing amazing. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the introduction.
Yep. Thank you for coming on. So I'll start with the humble beginnings, in a sense. Walk me through your first introduction to role-playing games and what made it stick.
Yeah. So my first role-playing TTRPG was an amalgamation of whatever I could find on the internet. I first started getting into role-playing because basically a family member or a friend of a friend introduced the concept of storytelling reacting, kind of like a choose your own adventure thing, but it was something that, you know, it wasn't like a book. It was someone telling you a story and they say, what do you do? And my cousin and I would sit down and do that like all day, right? We would sit down and we keep doing it. And the idea of putting stats to stories became a concept. And we played for hours and hours. And we looked up things like D&D. I've heard of D&D before, so I tried to look it up, and I ended up playing D&D 5e, Pathfinder 1e, and like whatever else I could find on the internet. So apparently in 5e I had a flat foot rating, which I didn't realize was a thing, but that's just how we ended up playing, you know, just whatever we could get our grubby little mitts on, because I didn't even realize that you could buy full copies of this book. I had made giant maps and designed stat blocks and things like that for a system that definitely did not exist.
Yeah, I can get that. And since you were jumping around with just about anything you could get your hands on, does that include some of the more experimental free projects that are all over the place, whether it be stuff on the Free RPG blog or stuff on 1K and 1KT?
When I was really young, not a whole bunch. I think when I was pretty young, there wasn't a whole ton of that I saw. But later, a little bit down the line, after a little while, once I started kind of getting more friends in the community and more people who knew more about other stuff than me, I ended up getting into like an older crowd. Not older, of course, but people who were into RPGs when they were still kind of a new concept. Not that they were when I was young, but when they were young and when they started playing, it was. So I got kind of exposure to like 2E, for instance, and some of the older styles. And that just branched out, and I had buddies who played GURPS, I had buddies who used the Fate system, I had friends that just got every TTRPG they could get their hands on. So, I mean, like, I've played a little bit of Blades in the Dark, goodness, I want to call it Starfinder, and I don't think that's the name of it. It's StarCraft? That's not it.
No. There was a StarCraft adaptation with Alternity back in the day, but it was just a glorified starter box set, so I don't really count it. But I don't think that's what you're thinking.
No, that's not it.
Star Wars?
But I ended up getting into that. GURPS was a really enticing idea to me. And when I posted the YouTube video, a lot of people mentioned GURPS a lot in the comments. And a lot of people compare Utopia to GURPS, which they're very, very different concepts. I don't think anybody can make GURPS again. I don't think you can make another GURPS, if I'm being so honest with you.
Well, plenty have tried.
No kidding.
I've picked on some of the GURPS faithful over the years, but I don't have any bone in that particular fight. Most of my picking on them has largely been the fact that there's one thing that a lot of Universalist games, the adherents of Universalist games don't tell a lot of players, and I think that they should. and that is that that because of the moving parts involved, there's going to be a bit of a higher floor with something like GURPS or something like Hero, especially Hero. I'd say Hero is a more infamous case than GURPS, even though GURPS gets a lot of the attention on that. But
For sure.
technically speaking, yes, you can do just about anything with a universalist game like GURPS. Practically speaking, the GM and the players are going to have to put in the work.
Yeah.
But that latter part is not often said.
Yeah. No, the setup time is definitely nothing to be scoffed at. And that was kind of the goal, I think, when designing Utopia. You know what I mean? I mean, it's never perfect, right? But the more elegant solutions that you can put into a system, the more the better ratio I feel like you can get to setup time to universalism, right? And Utopia is not a true universalism game, but I feel like it's a lot of what you can get out of a game that sets up as fast as D&D, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Would you say that Utopia is a multi-genre game instead of a universalist game?
No, 100%. I actually, for the longest time, called it, a standard TTRPG game until someone kind of came to me and made me realize that it's more of a system than it is a game. At least it is in its current form. The game does have a lot of flavor, but the flavor is not imbued into the manual that people see right now. And it's not designed to be. That's really meant to be just a core play the game type of book. The first expansion that's meant to come out is going to have a lot of the maps, a lot of the lore, the land, the colonized moon, and the sci-fi aspect versus the high fantasy aspect. And those are introduced in hopes of being able to capacitate any franchise, right? Whatever you want to play and whoever you want to be, there is some way that this system can adapt accordingly and give you a normal pacing, a good pacing even, a lot of design choices, mechanics attached to whatever you could think of, while still keeping it relatively simple enough for even new players to be able to get onto it.
Now, given that, within the full book, do you plan on putting some sort of conversion guide, not for converting other systems, but converting other settings into Utopia's framework?
That's actually been brought up a couple of times, and it didn't dawn on me that people kind of like really had a hunger for that until I started to get out and public with it, and people are like, how do I do this and how does this convert? And in my head, it kind of makes sense, understandably, because I've been exposed to the system for a really long time, and I think that's something that would be really important to introduce. If not in the main book, then somewhere, if that makes sense. Like just a little mini how-to guide that's like, this is how you can adapt whatever you want into this system. Here's how roughly the scaling works, you know what I mean? Here's what you can expect, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I can get that. And one of the things that I found quite interesting, and it's very much built within the system, is instead of doing full freeform, you have a set of skill tree designs in both the racial end of things and in what would be classes and specs in other systems, but are more general skill trees. And I'm curious what prompted you to go with a skill tree designed for the setup, or talent tree if we want to differentiate between skills and skills.
For sure. If I need to preface this by saying that I really don't hate class systems, I just hate how they've been done in some cases, right? I think the biggest thing to me is that when I'm going to use the biggest example, and I use this example a lot, and people often assume that I've only ever played D&D. I have played more than D&D, but it's a very universal example that a lot of people know. So I'm going to keep using it. If I pick a paladin at level 3 in D&D, right, I with the exception of multi-classing, know what the entire next 20 levels, or 17 levels rather, is going to look like. And I don't like that. I want to be able to kind of move around and adjust myself. There have been a lot of times where I've played a paladin and I'm like, oh, I want to break my oath. You know what I mean? And I can do that, and I can thematically do that, and I can role play my way through that, or I can do that. I can do whatever I want essentially on a thematic or storytelling level, but the mechanics will ultimately stay the same, right? There's not a lot of moving around to do. And multi-classing is kind of complicated in my opinion for what you get out of it, especially depending on what you do. So like for instance, if you have a 5th level spellcaster and a 9th level spellcaster multi-class, don't even get me started. That is a nightmare to me. And maybe I'm just dumb. I don't know. But,
I think it's more of a consequence of the fact that classes certainly have their place, but with some of the more complicated ways that multi-classing has been done in various games, especially in that bubble, it's putting something in that wasn't built in from the word go. And
yeah,
because of that, you have problems like say dip classes, where you're only picking it for a little bit to get one particular thing, or
yeah,
one of the other big problems that can happen, and I've seen this plenty of times, is what I call a false choice dichotomy, where you're picking stuff that isn't going to be useful for you now, but you're doing it to meet the prerequisites of something you actually want to get. My particular whipping boy for this sort of thing has always been the Whirlwind Attack feat back in 3rd edition and Pathfinder 1e. Because of the because Whirlwind Attack, for all intents and purposes, is the spin attack in every Legend of Zelda game since Link to the Past.
Yeah.
But in order to get it, you need to plan that out several levels in advance because of the prerequisites required. And while that's an extreme example, that concept is certainly there. So,
Gotcha.
When it comes to the talent trees that you have, would it be fair of me to say that it is more about that whole notion of picking something just as a stepping stone for what you actually want isn't as much of an issue because the prerequisites are tied to 3 stats always?
Kinda, yeah. So there's kind of a happy medium there, at least in my mind, right? So I don't want everything to be a game of, oh, get to this just so I can get to this, just so I can get to this, and at the end of the day, you've got one talent that you wanted, and 8 abilities that you don't care about, right? But at the same time, it's really nice to have a goal. I really like looking at the bottom of the page and go, man, I really want to do that. And you look up and you be like, that stuff is still useful. It's not what I'm going for, but it'll make the path easier. You know what I mean? There's your road snacks. Being able to attack faster is kind of a cool road snack in my opinion. But with that in mind, I think that ultimately the goal kind of is allowing you that chance of versatility, right? You can walk in with a goal in mind. You can be like, I want to attack as fast as possible, as hard as possible. And you can kind of create yourself a roadmap. And your roadmap may be similar, but very rarely is going to be the exact same as anybody else's. You know what I mean? You're not going to build the same character. You're not going to build, the exact same talent builds. You're not going to play the same species perhaps, but you can build roughly the same thing with your own little spin on it. Whereas, in my opinion, an Oathbreaker Paladin is an Oathbreaker Paladin. I mean, we can definitely play them thematically different, but on a mechanical level, they're gonna be really similar to each other, and I feel like there's more room for a character to shine. People are really cool and really creative with how they go about stuff. And I think facilitating that is the goal.
Yeah. Whoops. There's of course in the case of the paladin, there is the problem of the paladin being a rules mandated reason for the character who's playing the paladin to be a bit of a dick. Because of how stringent the oath is. And it has led to that DM. I don't need to name names. I'm not going to name names because everybody knows that DM. Everybody knows that guy.
Yeah.
Also, fuck that guy. Who puts the paladin in a fall or die situation, i.e., you break your oath, you become a blackguard, you become a oathbreaker paladin, or your character dies. Plenty of GMs who want to be dickish have done that stunt at least once. And I've always seen that as that feels very that makes the oath feel far too fragile.
Yeah.
If you look at character oaths in fiction, it is something that's kind of a guiding principle to their actions, but it's not something that they're really slavish to.
Sure. And I think at the end of the day, even if you wanted to be, right? Even if you wanted to be a slave to your oath, or whether you wanted to be loose on your oath, or just make it kind of like an accessory to your character more than a founding feature of your character, that should be your choice, right? As the owner of that character, as that being your avatar, that's something that you should have control over, whether whatever way you want to do it. And I don't feel like it gives all that much room to do so. At least in my opinion. Like you said, like hardlining what your role play should be is kind of wild. Like, I totally get it. Like, it probably built a vision in the eyes of the creator. And let me say, like, so much respect to the original creators. Gary Gygax was insane for tackling a project that he did at the time that he did. I did a lot of historical research when I was doing videos and stuff like that. Dude, like, really did it when it did not exist. This is a completely new concept. So back in the times of like 1E and 2E, you're running blind. But 5E, you kind of had a lot to work with, I feel like, in comparison at least. And I don't like the hardline roleplay. I don't like the kind of, to me, it feels like very tight boxes, personally.
And I've taken a philosophy when it comes to the roles that is not too far removed from the positions in a team sport. There's a certain thing that you're focusing on if you're say a tight end or a QB on a sports team, but it's not like it's a one-trick pony affair because, well, the play is gonna break down. And when that happens, it's gonna be more about, okay, what can you actually do to keep the play somewhat intact? Because, well, no plan survives the first encounter. Everybody knows this. But I get the feeling that the talent trees that you have, as you mentioned before, are kind of that happy medium. And this is where I wanted to focus on that whole body, mind, and soul points as kind of the main prerequisite when it comes to talents, aside from the talents on the given paths as the prereq.
Sure. So for anyone who doesn't know, every single talent has a body, mind, and soul cost. Now, you don't get body, mind, and soul points, you just get talent points. So if it costs 1 body, 1 mind, and 1 soul, it just costs 3 talent points, right? And when you take that, your body will increase by 1, your mind will increase by 1, so on and so on. This kind of produces a natural intuition for the character that's really important for the system. So if you're taking, combat stats, it's gonna be predominantly body points that you're gaining over time. A lot of people have asked me, like, why would you base a stat off a stat off a stat? And it's like, it's not meant to be like that, but it's like that it kind of feels like it needs to be like that. Because otherwise, when you take, for instance, again, those combat talents, if you start pumping all your social stats, you have a painfully rounded character. You have a way too capable character because you don't go into fighting every day of your life and suddenly, know how to talk at the bar. You know what I mean? That's not those skills don't line up with each other. So you're kind of forced to move into what you're good at or what your character would be good at, right? If you're going to take combat skills, you can raise all of your combat sub traits, but you're not going to be able to do your mental sub traits or your thinking sub traits without taking a little bit of mind in one of those talents, right? Whether you go down innovation, maybe take just a little moniker of magecraft or something along those lines. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. And
I think it's.
Oh, go ahead.
What's that?
I thought I had something, but go ahead.
I think it's been helpful in allowing characters to kind of become what they want to be while giving you a little bit of pushback if you want to min-max. Utopia has seen a lot of min-maxers, and so far I think they've enjoyed it quite a bit. And I'm not mad about min-maxing, of course, right? If you're in a group of min-maxers, have fun. And a lot of people told me it's impossible to balance, something that is universal. You know what I mean? And I was like, challenge accepted.
I'm not going to say it's impossible to balance, and I do think there's a degree of disinformation regarding the topic of game balance. I think some people conflate it as being the same, when in reality balance should be everybody gets some time to shine. And min-maxing is going to be inevitable. Even in the lightest of rules-light games, there's going to be some incarnation of min-max. The best that one can do is make it so that a min-max doesn't step on a min-maxer isn't going to step on everyone else's toes, like say casters in some fantasy games who are entire parties by themselves. Looking at you, cleric. And Druid. And Godzilla. And in keeping with that, one thing that I was a bit curious about is in regards to the magic question.
Yeah.
Because it looks like since you have a stamina pool, I think it's fair for me to assume that this is not doing the Vancian model, which I'm perfectly fine with. I never liked the Vancian, even when I started. But is it a case where your ability to learn magic is tied to talents? And if so, how?
Yes. So there are a number of talents. So magic is broken currently into 8 arts, and each art kind of has a number of characteristics that designs the spell, right? So if I have illusion, then I have the capability to modify sensory information, make you feel different things, make you see different things. If I have evocation, I can conjure elements, small bits of matter and things like that. But I can't make a spell have range or, summon further away from me without the Art of Array. I can't make it an AoE effect without the Art of Wake. In order to make it last longer, with some exceptions, I need the Art of Enchantment, and so on and so on. So the spell is broken down into its smaller facets, and then each one of those is given an art. So you can design any spell that you want and cast any spell that you want, as long as you know how to use the different facets of a spell. Or at least the spell that you're casting, right? So you can go your entire, wizard career without Array, and that'd be completely fine. But every spell that you cast is going to be a touch spell.
Mm-hmm. So, in that regard, would it be fair to say that meta magic or just modifying the way that you can use magic is going to take a bit more priority over like a spell list?
Yeah, so you can kind of do whatever you want. So there is obviously a listed number of spells, and that's for ease of use, right? You can go ahead and just pick one of those out and go, I like that. Maybe I want to move it around a little bit. But you can also go into the back of the book and you can just craft one from scratch. And all decisions are not final until you're just about to cast a spell. You can literally design it right then and there on the spot. You can have a pre-built list. You can have a modular list. So you're like, this is my spell, but I can modify it in this way, and this way to, fit my use case. Or you can just wing it. And all of those work. Spells are broken down into just their minor components, and each one of them have limitations and capabilities, and you just smash them together when you need them.
Mm-hmm. So, given that, if somebody wanted to say, I want to be a pyromancer, what sort of talents would they end up having to take in order to do that?
Yeah, so there is a specialist talent, which is kind of its own thing. Consider them similar to feats. They happen every 10 levels. You level a lot faster in Utopia, for reference. But Pyromancer gives you the option to have heat magic or fire magic be kind of like a cantrip, right? If it's within a certain ratio of your capabilities, you just get it for free. You don't have to pay anything. With that in mind, evocation is going to be the main thing that you use for dealing damage or producing element, so we're definitely going to want that. Enchantment allows it to last longer, which is awesome for fire, because usually when I light someone on fire, I want them to keep being on fire. Not always, but a lot of the time. Array will allow me to cast it at distance, which is also very helpful. Your natural fire bolts, your fireballs, your anything like that is going to want that distance. And then Wake is going to allow me to use AoE effects. So like Fireball again, for instance. So I would say that those are my main 4. Out of the 8, those 4 would really help you be a really good pyromancer. You don't have to take all of those, but that's probably your really good build right there.
Yeah, and I'm guessing spell use, just like the use of certain special abilities, is still drawing upon stamina points.
It is, yep. And that's part of how it works as well when it comes to limitations. Just because you have enough stamina to cast it doesn't mean you can. You also have a spell cap, which is based on some of your sub-traits. And you can't cast a spell that costs more than your spell cap. So like, let's say that you have a spell cap of 10. And let's say that you have a 2 stamina discount to any spell that you cast. You can't really cast a spell that costs more than 12, given it costs 10 for you, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I can get that. Now, one concept that I've talked a lot about on this channel is the Rome policy. All roads lead to Rome. And since you did a bit of historical study, you'll know that for several decades now, there has been the school of thought that there's one primary resolution mechanic, and everything kind of springs out from that as variants or whatnot. So what would that primary resolution be in Utopia? Is it D20 aim high? Are you doing aim low? Are you doing something in the middle? How are you having it work?
So Utopia uses 3d6, and the scaling works a little bit wonky in comparison to what I think a lot of like really seasoned players are used to. And I think that this is something that I never really thought about, but really kind of have to get down and dirty with sometimes, is that the numbers are just gonna get really big. If you are level 50, level 100, there's no maximum. They're gonna get really big. So your rolls are designed to get high. Your sub-traits linearly increase every level. So your modifiers will get massive. People at level 50, let's say, can have, plus 25 modifiers and crazy stuff like that. And that's by design, because you won't be able to play the late game without really big numbers. And hopefully the big static numbers will outweigh the circumstantial numbers, which is why the 3d6 to me is so important. 3d6 is going to average towards the middle, which means if your character's good at it, they're going to be more likely to succeed, and if they're bad at it, they're going to be more likely to fail, rather than having this big 1 through 20, roll in the dark.
Yeah, I can certainly get that. Now, with that in mind, since you said it's a 3d6, are we dealing with an aim? Are we dealing with an aim high?
Describe what you mean about that to me.
When I'm saying aim high or aim low, it's more about how the relationship with target number works. Aim high is a case where you have a certain target number you're trying to roll over it. Aim low would be you're trying to get under the target number.
Oh, I understand. I knew that. I should have put that together. I'm sorry. Yeah, no, it's definitely an aim high system.
Mm-hmm.
You definitely want to go up with bigger, larger numbers.
Yeah. To follow up on that, are there any special effects that might happen if a roll starts getting boxcars? Not all boxcars, but just any boxcars.
Boxcons?
Boxcars. You know, sixes.
Oh, I gotcha. So are you asking about criticals?
Pretty much. I didn't want to
Okay.
use the term critical because that carries its own connotations and I didn't want that assumption, since not all games.
I get ya.
Some games will have something like criticals, but they're not in the same vein.
I understand what you're saying. So they do kind of hold that value. Now, Utopia, at least melee combat and spellcasting, does not use roll to hit. So if you're in melee combat, you just deal damage. You roll damage immediately, and they try to deflect it. I always thought it was kind of weird to have melee hits miss so often in RPGs, and maybe that's just me, and maybe that's a culture thing that I completely fell off of.
It could also be that the dice gods just hate everybody. Wait, they do that anyways.
That is true. Honestly, yeah, no, that's pretty fair. But outside of those combats, you do have criticals. Since you have 3d6, you have to roll 3 6s or 3 1s.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's kind of exceptions to that, because the way that favor works is that you can either lose a die or you can add a die. And it's not drop the lowest, you just add it all together. So with 4 dice, your maximum is 24. And the ruling is that you need 3 6s no matter how many dice you have. So that means that if you have several points of favor, you have a much, much higher chance of a critical success, for instance. A critical failure, in this case, would be all 1s, no matter how many dice you have. So if you have favor, you're a lot less likely. If you have disfavor, you're a lot more likely. 1 point of disfavor, you go from 1 in 216 to 1 in 36.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose it's harder to get all boxcars or all snake eyes on a 3d6 roll. So I'm guessing because of that, whenever you do get them, there's a significant amount more impact.
Yeah, I personally prefer there to be. It is going to be a much rarer circumstance. You know, you're gonna get it around 1/10 of the time that you'd get a nat 20 or a nat 1.
Mm-hmm.
So personally, when I treat it with a little bit more significance, you know, I usually make something big happen, make something detrimental happen, make something, you know, huge happen, or what have you. But if nothing else, at least in the mechanics of the game, the actual hard ruling is that if you roll a critical success, you roll double. Right? So you take the value of the roll with the modifier that you're using, and you double the entire thing. A critical failure is a 0. It is always a 0.
Mm-hmm. Now you said that you're doing straight damage when it comes to melee combat. With ranged combat, would you be rolling to see if you hit or not in that case?
Yep, so you do have accuracy tests when it comes to ranged. And that was kind of to fight a little bit of just how powerful ranged is in general. Range is a really strong capability. You know, if I can hit you from 30 feet away and you can hit me from 5 meters away, all I have to do is be faster or fly. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So range is always going to have that level of this can always miss and melee can't miss. Melee can be blocked, deflected, ignored, and, you know, dealt with in a lot of ways, but it's not going to miss. That's not one of its problems. Whereas range can be cut off at you. You know what I mean? If you're doing a range attack, it can stop right then and there. And that also makes it so that a long-range weapon does not produce all of its power on its own.
Mm-hmm.
because the further you are away, the harder the test is going to get. So that means that even if you have a 200-meter weapon, you can still fail that. And the further away you are, the easier it is going to be to fail. Don't get me wrong, there are a lot of talents that help you get out of this. But whenever I say there is a talent for X, it means that you're going to have to begin to build your character around that concept, or at least move your character towards that concept if you want a higher success rate.
Mm-hmm. I can get that. Now, with that in mind, I know that you have the notion of block and dodge. Is it a case where one is for melee, one is for ranged, or could you use either as a response?
You can use either in any cases of damage generally. Not all, but most. One is a high risk, high reward. So dodging, you're gonna be rolling d12s, and you have to dodge all damage, and if you fail to do that, you take all damage. Blocking is d4s, and it is always negative, right? So you're always just gonna ignore some amount of damage.
Mm-hmm. So you're rolling block to reduce damage, and you're rolling dodge to try and get a all or nothing.
Yes. And in my playgroups, it's really funny because this was a whole concept, right? We were like, block is just better. I didn't fully think that. I liked dodging, but that's also because I'm like, I want to take a little risk every once in a while. But my group was kind of under the consensus that blocking is just better, right? You always get a resolute outcome. And I was just in the Discord before we started talking today, and people were like, dodge is just better. And I'm like, oh? And I'm like, so this is a little controversial. I see. I'm like, I like dodging personally. It's very often successful in my experience, but it's also extremely dependent on what you're fighting, right? Being good at both is awesome. It's expensive, but it's awesome because you can make an educated decision. Dodge is really good a lot of the time, but if something's simply bigger than you, it can out attack your highest potential dodge, and you're just boned.
Yeah. And I look at that as a case of balancing risk versus reward. You know, blocking is not going to be as risky as dodging is going to be, which is why it's using D4s instead of D12s. And I'm glad to see that the two most disrespected kind of dice are getting some love here. Yeah. Now, continuing on from that, I do find it amusing that even for a universalist game, you don't have a massive amount of what would be skills. In this case, would be the traits and sub-traits, because you've no doubt gone through GURPS and seen the skill list in that game and how it borders on offensive with how many skills there are.
It's definitely kind of insane for sure. Utopia, okay, I don't think I've ever explained this to someone, if I'm being honest with you. Utopia is kind of broken down in rules of 3s and 2s. I do know that I could give you a 1 million billion sub-traits, you know what I mean? And we would cover every single situation. Or I could give you 12 and we could cover every single situation. Albeit, we're going to be kind of moving things around a little more. And to me personally, at least in my opinion, that's kind of okay. If you're good at engineering, engineering is actually, that's probably my best example. Engineering covers, obviously, you know, if you had to work on a machine, if you had to fix an item or whatever. It's also your medical capabilities, because engineering is just your understanding of how to fix a system, right? And that includes living systems. Now, that might not be all that, like, you might not see that and think that, you know what I mean? But to me, if you were to look down the list, you'd be like, engineering is the closest. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and there were a lot of games throughout the 90s that tried to do that whole cover every situation with those absurdly long skill lists. Fantasy Games Unlimited is my whipping boy for that kind of thing. They did that a lot. And I've also gotten on cases of games like Shadowrun for having those absurdly long skill lists. And 6th edition skill list isn't as big as the others, but It is a problem, and it's a problem that's even worse when instead of levels, it is purely point based. When 5th edition Shadowrun came along, they tried to mitigate that with the priority system, but it can still be an issue. I like to call it a swim damn it issue. Basically throwing you into the deep end of the pool and saying just swim.
Yeah.
Because in the case of Shadowrun, it's the case of, okay, you've got this amount of karma and you spend it on your everything. Have at it. Which, yeah, does that give you a lot of freedom? Yeah. But it also leads to the issue of not knowing what the hell to do.
That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense.
And
I think that what's most important to me personally is that, like, something like tests, subtraits, and a bunch of things like that, it is cool to have a lot of them. It also makes it a lot harder to be good at something, in my opinion. Now, don't get me wrong, there's systems where you can just move out more points, right? If I give you double the subtraits, I could also give you double the subtrait points. But in that case, you can hardline one subtrait even more so now, right? You know, if power is what decides your weapon damage, for instance, and I create 12 more subtraits and I give you twice as many points, you could also just get twice as high power. You know what I mean? So there's definitely a balance to strike there, at least with Utopia's system. Adding more or removing some kind of moves everything around.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of how that's been Utopia's dilemma for like ever, is that people will be like, oh, why don't you just do this? Why don't you just change this? Why don't you just move this? It's like everything is very tightly knit. You know what I mean? It's just like you pull one thread and you know what happens, right? The thing unravels.
Yeah, we've all played Jenga.
Yeah, exactly. That's what it feels like. I'll be like, okay, I'm gonna change this one mechanic. It didn't fall this time. And sometimes it does fall. I've redone the crafting system over and over and over again. I made Python programs to auto-craft things like 4 times because I had to keep redesigning the system, and then the program becomes obsolete, and it's just like that. But as the game evolves and, you know, it needs to recognize more possibilities, even if it's trying to be universal, you know, it needs to withstand some level of scrutiny. So all of these systems kind of need to interwork with each other to give you a sense of balance, but a sense of independence at the same time.
Which certainly makes sense. And when it comes to crafting, that's another one of those things that a lot of people have made some attempts to do with some very mixed results. And I think it largely has to do with the fact that when you're having crafting semi-freeform, there's a lot of stuff that can add into, and in some cases they end up trying to end up overcomplicating it, or in some cases just trying to avoid it altogether. But people are gonna want to have that fantasy of crafting your own gear. I mean, we've got that in so many different fiction stories.
Yeah.
So even if you try to dodge it like 5e did, where they left that kind of thing blank, people eventually made crafting systems anyways.
Yeah. And that was always like such an important part to me, right? Like, what is a customizable system if you're going to be wearing a bucket on your head and you only have the choice of like weasel slippers or these gigantic combat boots or whatever, you know, like the limitations of items is huge to me, right? Like, we don't want to limit what our character can wear and use. Everyone has their signature item. You know, they have that thing that's like so attached to them, you know, their trident, their spear, their helmet, their tiara, whatever it may be. And I feel like that's like important to facilitate. And on a thematic level, you can just flavor it that way. But also, wouldn't it be cool if you could also like change its mechanics a little bit to fit your character and make it, you know, feel good? The crafting system has been a nightmare. I will say that much. But I think it's gone pretty well. There are definitely like a handful of issues that have popped up with it, like in just releasing it recently, showing people, they've been like, oh, hey, I found an infinite loop. And I'm like, oh, okay. It's in a vacuum, right? It's in one little small quadrant that you could just pull it out and it would be fine. But I still didn't catch it.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I was really excited to see, like, you know, it's gone through a lot of eyes now. Utopia's been through a decent amount of scrutiny, through min-maxers, through RP heavy, through thematic players, and all kinds of stuff. And, like, don't get me wrong, they've definitely found some balance issues. But when they found those, I was like, wait, is that all we found? I'm like, that's really awesome, honestly. Because it's like, yeah, don't get me wrong, people can like have preferences about the balance and things like that, but there's nothing game breaking that I found, or at least nothing that I find game breaking other than that the handful of infinite loops. And I'm like, that's pretty solid. Because it's like, it's okay if we get to debate about it. You know, we can argue. Like, hey, that seems really powerful. But it's another thing to be like, no, I don't think anything like completely removes the game from possibility, right? Like you just ruin the experience. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
I was just really excited and astounded that it was kind of holding up. You know, it was kind of like it was doing its tests. It was making it work.
Yeah, I can get that. Now, on the bestiary end of things, do you plan on having a proper bestiary list, or do you plan on having a monster creation system, or even a little?
I would like to have both. I think for me personally, when it comes to like, oh, what does a GM design and what does a player design, they're kind of in two separate categories, but I want them both ultimately to be possible, right? Because like, for instance, there is technically a limited number of species, but there's going to be a small expansion that says, A, this is how to play without a species completely, and here's how to design your own species within balanced guidelines of Utopia. Same thing with creatures, right? There's a number of creatures in Utopia. Here's how to make your own, because I know people are going to want to do that. On a less official level, I'd want to have a thing of how to adapt creatures, because people have asked me that a couple of times now. They're like, hey, can I grab this 5e creature and stick it in Utopia? And I'm like, you can. There's kind of a couple of things you need to check for, but yes, and that's kind of something I have to explain sometimes, and I'm figuring out the best way to go about that. And I don't really want to go through OGL. I don't want to necessarily publish that in any way or monetize that. I just want people to be able to do it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I can get that.
But I do plan on having a larger bestiary in like the first expansion. In the first addition to Utopia, there will be a lot more creatures to kind of get your teeth into, rather than the small handful that existed. I tried to do a diverse example of about a dozen in the first book, because I'm like, it's just enough to get the point across. You know what I mean?
And with the... It sounds like it's going to be avoiding something that was a bad habit of a lot of designers back in the early 2000s, which was having characters and monsters, and I'm just using the monster term colloquially, being built the exact same way, and that didn't last because it doesn't come off very satisfying.
Yeah. I think that's kind of one thing that kind of dawned on me in part of development, is realizing like, it's really important to me that a player can become anything, right? But also, there are sometimes things that a creature can do that you just can't unless you make a character designed around that creature, right? And in a lot of scenarios, like, creatures aren't going to develop like you are. They're not going to level like you are. Can they? Sure, absolutely. You can make them do that. And they use the same stats ultimately, so you can, break it down and do that if you want. But naturally, it's just not a player. They're two different things, you know what I mean? By nature. I think it would be good if you can adapt one way or the other, but I think that players should feel special. Ultimately, you are the ones that are running this story. You're doing the thing. You are the ones that are important here. And just leaving some of those facets to you. And creatures don't always get that. Sometimes creatures can do a thing that you can't. So you'll have to find a way to be able to do that. Because chances are there'll be a way you can find it. But
yeah, I can certainly get that. Now, With that said, what are you shooting for as far as a page count for the core book of Utopia?
Like what is the final goal of the core book?
Yeah, because the current version that you have, the Ashcan version as I've called it, is about 209 pages. So I was curious what you had in mind as far as what you'd be shooting for a total page count, like 300.
I think that I really didn't want the page count to be super high. I think that if it could be below 250, I would be ecstatic. And that's been a big problem, is I've just been cranking back pages. You know, there used to be 15 species and a total of like 38 subspecies instead of 15. There used to be a lot more spells. There was a lot more items and creatures and stuff like that. And I'm like, I don't want that to be the point of this book, right? The point of this book is the system in place. The goal is not to give you a massive glossary. There will be a massive glossary. That's just not this book. This book is to tell you how to play the game, how this interacts, mechanics to world, right? How does this put mechanics on your narrative if you want them? And how can you change it if you want to? That is the important feature of this book to me. And I want to say that in the simplest way possible to keep it accessible, low barrier to entry, and digestible.
Yeah. And 250 is a standard range to go with. I had figured it might be larger because of the multi-genre nature and just all the stuff you have to go into.
Yeah.
But what would you be shooting for as far as a release window? Not a date per se, but a general ballpark.
I'm hoping for April, and I know that's pretty close by, but I've kind of like lined things up as best as I can. Before I started the Kickstarter, before I started the funding, I lined as much as I could up, and I said, hey, if this works, I'm gonna pull the trigger right now, right? And I think that it's just about there, right? Like we're past the point of no return, I think. I think that it's happening, which is wild to say. Let me say, you know, this has been something that's been trapped in my noggin for a long time that I used to play with my friends every once in a while, and it just turned into a thing. But hopefully, if everything works out, I'll be able to spend about 3 months just itching down kind of the balance issues that happen, the glaring issues, and the clarifications that didn't exist yet. Put all of those things in, fix it up, and then push it into publishing and call it a day. Get it out fast, if that makes sense. Not hasty. I don't want to make that sound like I'm just trying to like throw it out the door. That's not my goal here. If there has to be a delay for the sake of quality of the final product, there has to be. But I think that things have been kind of lined up under the hood well enough to be able to avoid that.
I could certainly see it. And I'll be looking forward to seeing how it develops. But with that,
I really appreciate that a lot.
But with that said,
what's that?
I do want to sincerely thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to come all the way to my temple and enjoy the madness that happens around here. And
I really appreciate you having me. This was awesome.
Anytime you see fit to return, whether it's for more of Utopia or for laughing at someone getting screwed over by the dice gods, the door is always open. As I often say around here, drinking is not mandatory, but it is encouraged. And, of course, a sincere thanks goes out to everyone who took the time out of their schedule to come onto the show and enjoy the madness. And there'll be plenty more where that came from, as there always is here, on the open bar of the internet. But until then, on behalf of the good brothers present and not present, my name is Mildra. I am your gaming monk. Stay fucking frosty, everybody.